Good afternoon. Also from me, my big thanks to being here. I feel a little bit of a stranger in the room since I am a pure clinician, far away from biomed, but I'll try to do my best. I brought a paper, so I want to do this precise. So in today's talk, I would like to shift your attention a little bit from biomed to what I would like to call, where is the arrow, psychocrinology, a new term in how we must try to not forget the child or the patient with GRIN-2B condition with both soma and psyche, and not to forget the well-being and the impact of family functioning and the wider context. I deliberately leave some time left for discussion at the end of my talk, but I understand that the Q&A is later, so please be my guest. In my field of pediatric neuropsychology, we tend to think about our patients' well-being and behavior from a so-called brain behavior model. This model tries to tell us that on the bottom, mental and adaptive functioning, daily life functioning is the resultant of how the infant brain was developed, with indeed a very strong control of genetics, but also environment. And then how brain develops determines, of course, the integrity of later brain structures and brain functioning, and that is hopefully effective and efficient. Both integrity and efficiency lead to a particular neuropsychological profile, with clear strength and weaknesses too in neurocognition. And neurocognition would be in terms of attention, awareness, of course, attention control, memory processing, learning abilities, learning disabilities, eye-hand coordination, broader psychomotor functioning. In other words, how the brain system processes and responds to information, and how a person can understand and respond to the outer world. All this together can be defined as a child's neurodevelopmental status. And indeed, the neurodevelopmental status is a strong predictor of mental and adaptive functioning. However, that all can only be evaluated in the right way against the background of a child's personal and environmental context, family history, socioeconomic status, all sort of other stressors, history, cultural issues, values, beliefs, expectations of the surrounding in everybody's own micro and more outer world. Then I like to introduce you to my consultation room. When applying this brain behavior model to the GRIN-2B population, one could generally say that indeed brain development is atypical as a result, of course, of the pathogenetic variant and the gene deletions of GRIN-2B. Most likely, the atypical brain development has immediate detrimental effects on maybe brain structure, but indeed brain functioning, with all consequences for neurodevelopmental in terms of developmental delay, intellectual disability, muscle tone abnormalities, feeding disorders, epilepsy, visual impairment, and whatnot. Children with GRIN-2B look cute, of course. However, a lot is going on at and under the surface. They, as a group, show a wide range of behavioral difficulties and are, as a group, not always well enough equipped to adapt and live up to the standards of what we declare normal in our Western, modern and normative society. May be true that maybe there's just too much life asks from the brains of these children. The brain behavior model can also be translated in a broader framework that is made by the World Health Organization, and that is called the International Classification of Functioning. The ICF is created to find a common language to document and measure health and disability of a disabled person, of a child with special needs. But it also is to record the environmental factors that affect the child's development and delays and challenges therein. For instance, in my consultation room, and some of the people here know my consultation room, there may be one aspect of the child's functioning that is at that particular moment is at stake. What I would do as a neuropsychologist is put up GRIN 2B, up there as a health condition, and then put mental or sensory function or difficulties in there, in that little box. And whatever topic of interest in a particular situation, and then think and talk with the parents. If this is the cognitive problems that you see in your child, what does it mean for activities in daily life and for participation? And then just talk that through. In these lower levels, you can chart what this all means for the environment and for the child's personal perspectives, but also the other way around, from the environment and the personal factors up to the impact of those factors on mental functioning, thinking, and responding. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. In the context of this brain behavior and the ICF model today, I would like to focus a little bit more on the concept of intellectual disability. Earlier, years before, we referred to that as mental retardation. Intellectual disability is an impaired general mental capacity that involves all sorts of cognitive skills. You have the reasoning, the planning, solving problems, comprehending complex ideas, learning efficiently, and learning from doing by experience. Historically, the ID has been defined only by these cognitive deficits that may be established through standardized measures of intellectual functioning. We heard people talking about this, and you may have heard from those tests, of which they commonly are used, the Wechsler scales, Bailey scales, or whatever. And using those tests, the ID was defined an ID, I mean an intellectual disorder, was defined with an IQ below 70, which is 2 standard deviations below the mean in the same aged population. But however, today, we do not focus only on those cognitive deficits, but also on deficits in functional and adaptive skills. Indeed, all in the wider context of social and emotional functioning. And functional and adaptive skills are very important, as they tell us how well equipped somebody is to conform to developmental and social cultural standards for independency and social responsibility. That's important, of course, too. And adaptive functioning refers to skills that are necessary for us and for our children to navigate through the big demands that are placed on us by the environment. Is it possible for your child to go to school? Is it safe? Does he or she know how to relate to strangers? Has he or she any clue about the value of money? Can he or she tell time? The terms mild to profound have been used to describe the severity of the whole concept of intellectual disability, so IQ and adaptive functioning. And in GRIN 2B, literature tells us about 15% of the patients have a mild intellectual disability, about 20% have moderate intellectual disability, and severe to profound intellectual disability is about 60% of our patient group. However, as a clinician, I find it difficult to think of intellectual disorder as a behavioral difficulty or a disorder in itself. I mean, of course, I know and I fully understand that dealing with a child with an intellectual disability comes with a whole load of challenges, and obviously in combination with a whole load of comorbid problems. But we may agree that a behavior difficulty or disorder is something different than a strict intellectual disability. I would say that a difficulty or a problem in the child occurs when there is an imbalance between what the child exposes and what one would expect on the basis of their intellect, or when the child's social or emotional well-being is at stake, or there is a significant gap between intellectual functioning, emotional well-being, and the level of adaptive functioning. Because if there is an imbalance, what we see is there is an uncomfortable and unhappy child. And you can, of course, label ID as a problem in itself, but then my question would be, is the child unhappy or uncomfortable? Or do we as outsiders feel discomfort in terms of grief, non-acceptance, and a so painful and delicate situation that you're in with your child? However, going back to ID and an unhappy and comfortable child, and this is where I would like to introduce the concept of sensory information processing. First, it's important to distinguish two types of information. We have the exteroceptive sensory information, and that is information that is processed by the brain, and it comes from outside of the body. This comes to our sensitivity to objects, to occurrences in the external environment. That happens through our 5 or actually 7 senses like sight, smell, hearing, touch, taste, but also vestibular, our perception of how our body is in relation to gravity, to movement, to balance, and balance. And we have the proprioception, and that is the sense of letting us know where exactly our body parts are or how we are positioned in space and in place and how we plan our movements. And then we have the interoceptive information, and that is information that also must be processed by the brain, but it comes from the body inside. This helps us to regulate body temperature, hunger, thirst, digestion, sleep, and all that. And having trouble with that sense also makes self-regulation a problem. And sensory information processing, both of the extero or interoceptive information, can be looked at as a 3-stage construct, including registration of information, integration, and modulation. And these functions in sensory processing are identified as sensory processing disorder. Registration, it includes basic sensory deficits, so impaired sense of hearing, sense of vision, taste, or whatever, or difficulties in discriminating or interpreting qualities of sensory stimuli in one modality or more, but within that modality. Sensory integration problems, something different. Those include sensory-based motor disorder in children who have difficulties in vestibular and proprioceptive information in combination with other senses, and that makes motor problem or poor postural control. Clumsiness, poor handwriting, dyspraxia, difficulties walking, all those things. And sensory modulation difficulties are defined as sensory modulation disorder. And then children have an impaired regulation of the intensity of responses. So they speak up too loud. They're extremely sensitive to light, for instance. They don't want to have their hair shampooed. They withdraw and get over-aroused in certain situations, like in supermarkets and so on. I hope you recognize this. In fact, sensory processing is based on 2 constructs: on neurological thresholds for response to sensory stimuli, that is described from a range from low threshold to a high threshold. Individuals with a high threshold may not be too responsive. They do not pick up really easy things that theoretically are around you. So you can, in a way, sort of be easily in a very crowded area or in very alive and noisy spaces. Individuals with low thresholds may be quick to notice and to respond to stimuli because their system is easily activated. This model suggests that neural regulation, and of course that is where this story of Hilgo we just heard comes in, this regulation between high and low threshold has to do with the balance between the excitation and inhibition. That's how the thresholds for information processing and sensory information processing are created. And the other construct would be the behavioral response. That it also exists on a continuum based upon whether people have passive tendencies and are not too prone to act in response to their environment, while others have a more active strategy and try to actively control, either engage or protect themselves to the amount of sensory information of input in their environment. Other than the neural threshold, it is believed that the behavioral response is more influenced by genetic makeup, by personal styles, and environmental factors. And these two constructs serve as axes that can cross and become and to form quadrants. So at the top, you see the low registration, children with a high threshold, not too sensitive to information coming from their environment, and passive behaviors, not approaching, not just doing nothing, not reacting at all. Those are the low registration children. You have them with high thresholds, active behavior. They're not tend to feel so much about what is going on around them, but they're very active, so they're sensory seeking, they're going out, they're wild, they'll... And you have the children with the low thresholds but active behavior. They tend to avoid sensory because they have a very high sensitivity of reacting to their environment and active behavior, so they know how to refrain from a situation. And you have the children with the low thresholds and the passive behavior. Those are the sensory sensitivity, children who are very sensitive to sensory information. Well, then you can get this sort of diagram, seeking, avoiding, sensitivity, and registration. One can imagine that these patterns of sensory information processing are associated with some distinct characteristics of other neurodevelopmental disorders. For instance, the sensory seeking children may be labeled as ADHD, and or the avoiders can be labeled as children with autism spectrum syndrome. However, and more research on this topic, of course, especially in GRIN-opathies, is needed. But to me, it would be so important to focus our attention not on those labels of intellectual disorder, ASS or ADHD, but instead on how a person can function in his or her environment and how he or she is able to process and respond and act on the amount of sensory information that comes to their brains. And of course, how somebody can function in his or her environment given the intense sensory processing patterns and imbalances therein. They have that because they have those information processing problems due to synaptic trafficking, yes. And given all that, what then are treatments for the whole wider concept of intellectual disability and sensory processing? Of course, as we are here together, there is an enormous need to address and mitigate the underlying cause of the intellectual disability, and in this case would be genetic therapies or whatever for the GRIN-opathy. And indeed, and that's where we all work so hard on, also in our NSU lab in Amsterdam, is targeted pharmacological treatment with the aim to improve the functional skills, the balance between excitation and inhibition. But also, and that is what I feel a strong responsibility for, I would really like to make a case of what I today call psychogrinology, and that is influencing and shaping a child's environment in a way that suits their level of intellectual functioning at this point, and their parents' patterns of sensory modulation in order to maximize their functioning and their quality of life now. Because in the here and now, there are truly both environmental and personal factors that can be influenced by non-pharmacological interventions. In terms of products and technology, there are so many assisting communication devices, for instance, sensory modulation therapy. We have climates and environments to shape dosing light, sounds, vibrations, whatever is needed for the need of the patients. There are special education programs, living groups, and There are norms, practices, ideologies within families and communities that need our attention, let alone the complexity of our health service for parents, but also for health professionals. Everybody knows what a hell of a job it is to build the right network about your child, but also for health professionals themselves to work effectively in multidisciplinary teams across border, across countries, across hospitals, across institutions, across every social domain really. And the influence of the immediate family on the child's behavior and vice versa. You may know that the prevalence of depression and PTSS is so high amongst parents and children with GRIN-opathies. And of course, with all understanding, but addressing those problems could be of tremendous value to our patients and the wider families, even in terms of activity and participation, and in bodily function in terms of mental functioning and self-regulation. So my suggestion for today would be keep up the good work in trying to mitigate and develop whatever therapy is needed to get rid of this horrible disease. But in the meanwhile, let's not forget each other and help each other in a way that's accessible to everybody. Thank you.